For this first part, we're going to take a look at exchange rates and where they come from. Imagine that you are in Econoland. Businesses are producing goods and services, some of which are exported to other countries. Likewise, residents of Econoland import some goods and services from other countries. None of this importing and exporting would be possible without the foreign exchange market, which is the market for exchanging one currency for another. The price in the foreign exchange market is just the price of one currency in terms of another and is referred to as the exchange rate. In Econoland, your currency is called the EcoBuck. The exchange rate for the EcoBuck is expressed as the number of foreign currency units per one EcoBuck. The exchange rate for the foreign currency unit is simply the reciprocal of the exchange rate for the EcoBuck. For example, imagine that you want to buy a t-shirt from Macroville. In order to do this, you will need to exchange some of your EcoBucks for Macrobucks. The foreign exchange market allows you to make this exchange. Let's imagine that the EcoBuck exchange rate in the Macrobuck EcoBuck currency market is a half of a Macrobuck per EcoBuck. This is equivalent to a Macrobuck exchange rate of 2 EcoBucks per Macrobuck. In this case, if the t-shirt costs 15 Macrobucks, then you would need 30 EcoBucks in order to purchase it. Now let's see what happens if the exchange rate changes. Imagine that the EcoBuck exchange rate changes to a third of a Macrobuck per EcoBuck. Remember that this is equivalent to saying that the Macrobuck exchange rate is 3 EcoBucks per Macrobuck. Now, in order to purchase the t-shirt that costs 15 Macrobucks, you will need 45 EcoBucks. In this example, the number of EcoBucks per Macrobuck increased, which means the Macrobuck appreciated. If we look at it from the other perspective, the number of Macrobucks per EcoBuck decreased, which means the EcoBuck depreciated. So where does an exchange rate come from? Remember that an exchange rate is simply a price of one currency in terms of another. Like any price, the equilibrium exchange rate is simply determined by supply and demand in the relevant market, in this case, the market for a particular currency. Now let's think about what the supply and demand curves look like. As we do this, it will be important to understand who is represented by the supply curve and the demand curve in each of the foreign exchange markets. In this two-currency model, the demand for EcoBucks is equivalent to the act of supplying Macrobucks. Residents of Macroville might demand EcoBucks for several reasons. For example, they might demand EcoBucks in order to travel to Econoland, to purchase goods and services from Econoland, or to purchase assets from Econoland. They also might demand EcoBucks for speculative reasons because they expect the EcoBuck to appreciate in the future. For reciprocal reasons, residents of Econoland may demand Macrobucks, as represented by the demand curve for Macrobucks and the supply curve for EcoBucks. Now that we have the supply and demand curves in each of our foreign exchange markets, we can understand where the equilibrium exchange rate comes from. The equilibrium exchange rate simply exists where supply and demand intersect each other. As we stated earlier, the equilibrium exchange rate for the EcoBuck was a half of a Macrobuck. The equilibrium exchange rate for a Macrobuck is 2 EcoBucks, as we can see on the graph. Now that you have a basic foundation about exchange rates, it's time for you to get some practice.